All right, folks, last chapter, the final chapter. Chapter 49, I'm going to cover response to terrorism and disasters. It's really kind of more of a general informational chapter than anything in this day and age, really, since the events of 9/11 back in 2001. This has become a much hotter topic, become much more highly discussed concept, and has really kind of rolled into just about every major textbook and curriculum that's out there for EMS anymore. Just like with the rest of the chapters, if you have not read and studied the chapter on your own, please do so at your earliest chance. Simply listening and watching the lecture is no replacement to reading and studying on your own. Our education standard that we apply here is a knowledge of operational roles, responsibilities to ensure the patient, public, and personal safety. All right, our objectives. Find a few of those on pages 1059 and 1060. All right, so an introduction. Occasionally, we find ourselves in a catastrophic disaster, something that no one anticipated or could even really truly fully prepare for. Luckily, it is a fairly uncommon thing. It's fairly rare, but it's definitely something that is real. It's definitely something that we could potentially have to deal with at some point in our careers. So natural disasters, in here in the Great Plains, we know that floods are potential and tornadoes are potential, as well as potential for acts of terrorism. One of the most important Air Force bases in the world is right here in the Omaha metro area. So not to mention a number of nuclear power plants that are not far. There is all kinds of potential. So our response can be impaired if the event overwhelms our resources. We know that a mass casualty incident is anything that overwhelms our system. So luckily, earthquakes are not a very high probability. Volcanic eruptions for us are almost a impossibility. I'm not going to say it is completely, but but we certainly have our share of storms. Could even be things as bad as a extreme blizzard. And of course, terrorism, usually without warning, and those are designed to affect heavily populated areas. There are the potentials that we have domestic terrorism. I think most people like to think, about, well, if there's going to be a terrorist attack, it's going to be foreign. But remember, one of the biggest terrorism events in the United States history prior to 9/11 was the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, and that was an act of domestic terrorism. So somebody that was an American citizen attacked us on American soil. So, we have to be prepared. We have that potential that always exists. In the smaller cities, smaller towns around here, the likelihood of terrorism is probably smaller, but maybe what they're looking for is something smaller. I remember that shortly after 9/11, we had to be extremely vigilant in keeping all of our exterior doors to our ambulance facilities closed and locked, because there was some discussion on terrorists trying to steal emergency vehicles and use those as ways to cause terroristic events, simply for the fact that people don't generally consider stopping an emergency vehicle. So the National Disaster Medical System, or the NDMS, is a section of the Department of Health and Human Services that's responsible for managing federal medical response to an emergency or disaster. They have a whole another system of medical courses that you can take, BDLS, ADLS, Basic Disaster Life Support, Advanced Disaster Life Support, and I know that there are several gradations to that as well. All right, always consider the safety precautions. It's good to be prepared ahead of time. So as I mentioned in the hazardous materials chapter, doing a little pre-planning is often one of the best things that we can do to anticipate what could potentially be targets here. So things like hospitals, nursing homes, schools, large office buildings. Knowing that those have the potential to be struck by terrorism, but also think about the disasters. I mean, those same buildings have the potential to be struck by a tornado. So considering where do we potentially have large populations helps us pre-plan these things. So might be involved in a large-scale response outside your jurisdiction as well. So you hear about things, large-scale incidents like tropical storms, hurricanes, or the major disasters, the major terroristic events, in which responders come from all across the United States. One of the big problems that they have when there's these large-scale incidents is self-dispatching, and that's one thing that the responders on scene, as well as all the disaster specialists in the world, say it's actually a much bigger problem when people self-dispatch themselves to go down to these scenes and just take off in a truck, take off in an ambulance, and just show up and just start doing stuff. It creates a logistical nightmare. So a concerted effort that is organized perhaps through emergency management agencies or various state and local offices, that they know exactly who's coming, and that makes a much easier time of handling the situation. Don't let unusual circumstances distract you from performing scene size-ups. I mean, imagine something like responding to the Boston Marathon bombing from what was that, like 2 years ago now. So imagine responding to that and wondering, wow, what could be all around me here? So remain alert, but remember, you're there. You need to keep your eyes open. Work within your ICS system. Carry out the duties as assigned. Remember, you may not be doing everything that you were originally taught to do. You may only be doing triage, in which you're assessing people quickly and moving on. You may be in the treatment sector, in which you're not actually going to transport people. You're just going to take care of treating them. Or maybe in transport, where you don't have all your toys and all your equipment. You're simply moving the person from point A to point B. Remember to do your windshield assessment. So what can I see from the windows of my vehicle? Report the nature, number of suspected patients, and that can be very difficult to assume, and then the need for additional resources. As you continue on, carefully assess the potential for the danger at the scene. If you believe it's still dangerous, remove yourself from that scene. Carefully observe your surroundings. Protect yourself, your coworkers, patients, bystanders. You need to get people out of there. Get people out of there. So I'm taking all hazards approach to the situation and anticipate as many potential dangers as possible. If we're talking, things that are tornado related, we have unstable structures, unstable scenes. Is there the potential for another tornado or storm to come through? Do we have lightning as a potential hazard here? We probably have down power lines. We maybe have ruptured gas lines. So there's all kinds of potentials. So if we're talking maybe a terroristic event, then perhaps we're needing to consider, is there secondary and tertiary events that may occur. So there have been times in which they have identified secondary bombs that were intended to go off 20 or 30 minutes after the original incident, to then harm the responders that responded in to try to help out the situation. Geography and climate. So, are we talking about things that people maybe are very remote? Of course, here in the Great Plains, we have the potential for very hot summers and very cold winters, and anything in between. Do we have threats of safety? So actions of desperate and disoriented patients that don't understand everything that's going on. Well-intended but unsafe actions by bystanders attempting to help. Consider hazards such as floodwaters, aftershocks, earthquakes, continued storms, second and third and fourth phases of storms, gas lines, electrical lines, unstable structures and vehicles, high winds, explosions, hazardous chemicals, radiation, biologic. Use the PPE that you're trained to use. Be aware of the passage of time, your feelings, your fatigue, rest, drinking fluids, eating. Sometimes we get stuck into go, go, go hero mode so much that we forget to take care of ourselves. Remember, dead and injured EMTs don't do anyone any good. So if you've got to step out, then you have to step out. Aftermath of active terrorism or natural disaster will most likely be one of the most psychologically taxing events in your career. It's probably something you'll never see again. Probably, once at best, once in a career. Not everyone is well suited to operate during an MCI outside their jurisdiction. It doesn't make you less qualified as an EMS professional, but does require you to communicate this information before being deployed. So a lot of times there's a natural assumption that paramedics show up in the ambulance, and as much as the public assumes that, it's possible that jurisdictions down the road maybe not fully understand how we staff. So they may believe that a paramedic ambulance showed up, particularly if it says paramedic on the side of it, and then come to find out they've got a couple of EMTs or an AEMT or maybe a driver or what have you. So it's important that as we're checking into a scene or checking in with command when we arrive, that they understand our full capabilities. Do not be afraid to ask questions or express your concerns. Disaster mental health services are a critical part of the response to these events as well. A lot of times there will be a debriefing or diffusing after the fact, and it may require you to have additional assistance, and that's okay. I've mentioned from very early parts of this course, everybody struggles in this career from time to time, and professional assistance is nothing to be ashamed of. All right, so be aware of the nature of the weapon or the destructive force of the natural disaster when assessing the patients in a natural disaster terrorism event. Remember, that's going to help us determine the mechanism of injury, the nature of illness. So if we're talking about a tornado, we're talking about hundreds of miles an hour wind. Many of us have seen some of the aftermaths of tornadoes. Assume for a high potential of multiple casualties with multi-system trauma. All right, natural disasters. These occur all over the world. Typically are weather related: blizzards, floods, wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes. Patient injuries can range from blast injuries to crush injuries, depending on what happened. So a tornado may come through, may puncture puncture gas lines, cause explosions. Of course, the potential for it to knocking over or throwing around large structures, heavy structures, is enormous. So the potential for someone to be crushed, suffering a blunt trauma, penetrating trauma. I've heard of things in which people have been thrown around in a tornado. In fact, one person was thrown around in a tornado, and the tornado had such an awesome force to it that the patient was actually got part of their bowel looped around a little sapling. So they had suffered an abdominal evisceration, and the loop of bowel actually went around a tree. So, of course, burns, hypothermia, hyperthermia, inhalation injuries certainly could be another potential. Caring for patients complicated by obstacles, getting to the scene and transporting patients. I've listened to several different speakers who spoke about responding to tornado events, in particular Joplin, Missouri from a couple years ago, and how really their EMS response was on foot because the town was so destroyed that they couldn't drive the ambulance to the patient. It was picking up the patients, moving the patients to the ambulance. Another interesting thing that they thought about after the fact was all their street signs were destroyed during the incident. So they ended up, as their recovery process went along, taking spray paint and spray painting the names of the streets on the pavement because they couldn't reference a street sign, and all their landmarks were gone. So I thought that was something I hadn't even really considered, that we rely so much on our landmarks and our street signs that we didn't have those to use to help us navigate. What an incredible disadvantage it put us at. Hospitals can be damaged. That was another thing they brought up in the Joplin response, was one of their major hospitals was destroyed. So they were unable to care for patients. They had to move patients from the hospital to other locations. Long-term things: water contamination, interruption of water supply, waste. I've heard about Hurricane Katrina coming through down in New Orleans, and how they ended up moving people to the Silver Dome down there, whatever the Dome Stadium is down in New Orleans, and they didn't have sewage down there, so they had people defecating and urinating just wherever in the stadium. So lack of electricity, the potential of infectious disease, the spread of that disease now with no waste disposal. Do we have food? We may not even have electricity. Most hospitals have backup generators, but what if the generator's destroyed? Sometimes we also have man-made disasters, such as apartment buildings, hospitals, nursing home fires, gas pipeline explosions, airlines, train crashes, building or bridge collapses, other events that occur that are going to require responses similar to that of a natural disaster. Terrorism. Terrorism is the use of violence to intimidate and incite fear in a population with the goal of social, political, or religious change, or in retaliation for acts perceived of threat or injustice. and that's really what the Oklahoma City bombing was all about. It was in retaliation, or at least theorized, it was in retaliation to the Waco Branch Davidian compound David Koresh attacks from a couple years earlier. Targets. So this is the symbolic structure. So whether it's a monument or a religious institution, weapons of mass destruction. These are designed to kill and injure large numbers of people, cause damage to man-made and natural structures. Terrorist groups. These can be categorized by the nature of their organizational sponsorship as either domestic or international. Domestic, citizens of the same country, and international, from different countries. May have state-sponsored groups, provided resources by a recognized government. I think that some people would argue that what's going on in the Ukraine, Crimea, and Russia and whatnot is, some people would argue that would be a state-sponsored group. Unsponsored group, they may not have a governmental support. Of course, you can also have lone wolf terrorists, single person who works alone without the support of a group or government. I think that was probably more the Oklahoma City case. All right, so to define the following terms: incendiary device, conventional explosives, biologic weapon of mass destruction, and chemical weapons. All right, so incendiary devices, we can find these actually as we go along on 1063, so we will touch on those real quickly. Incendiary devices are things intended to start fires, so Molotov cocktail or explosives. You have conventional explosives, which is more of a bomb. So it's not really intended to start fires, it's really intended to have large blast force behind it, as opposed to a fire force. A lot of conventional explosives also have shrapnel in them, so that's things that are intended to stick and cause projectile damage. Biologics. This is something that is intended to disseminate either a biological toxin or a pathogen to make people ill. And then chemical weapons would be those that are used as a toxic chemical to cause illness or injury. So this might be something like mustard gases or cyanides, so on and so forth. CDC's categories of bioagents. Category A, B, and C. You can read through those there. I don't think that it's important that we spend a ton of time on those, but Category A is the most virulent, Category C the least virulent. So we know things like anthrax and smallpox and Ebola and those sorts of things have the potential to be extremely devastating. So botulism, we've mentioned botulism before. Botox, remember, this is one of the most toxic substances known to man. And then we have some Category Bs. Most of these are not very common to hear about. Ricin. Ricin comes from castor beans. That one occasionally is, we hear about that being distributed via the mail. And then hantavirus, we've heard of that. We've talked about hantavirus. It's really a rodent issue. Okay, in our weapons of mass destruction, we would want to, in a chemical agent, of course, remember our RAIN mnemonic again. Recognize it, avoid it, isolate, and notify. Vesicants are something that cause blisters. We also have things that are cellular asphyxiants, such as cyanide, which it actually interrupts the ability of the cell to use oxygen. Again, cyanide is probably the biggest one there. Vesicants are the ones that cause basically severe illness and causes major fluid shifts into the blisters. Often also has a respiratory function to it. Choking agents. So these are things that will actually affect your respiratory system. So maybe something that displaces oxygen. Riot control agents, fairly low lethality. However, it's intended to disable a fairly good size population, at least for a temporary amount of time. Often requires there to be a major decontamination before people can be fully back up and running. Vomiting agents can cause, obviously, people to vomit, causes severe irritation of the gastrointestinal tract. Nerve agents, these are the most toxic, can cause death in minutes. So things such as sarin fall into this category. A lot of times these nerve agents are organophosphate in nature. We've talked about organophosphate poisoning way back in toxicology when we talked about the sludge mnemonic. So sludge is salivation, lacrimation, urination, defecation, gastric distress, and emesis. You can also use dumbbells for this, and dumbbells is diarrhea, urination, meiosis, or constricted pupils, bradycardia, bronchorrhea, bronchospasm, emesis, lacrimation, and salivation. May also cause some facial twitching as well. So if we're dealing with a chemical agent, again, protect ourselves from contact with the substance. Allow the trained personnel with proper PPE to remove and decontaminate our patients. Anticipate the need for ABC support. Consider the use of your antidote kits. These are probably initially intended for use on yourself or your peers. So the Mark I kit contains 2 medications, atropine and pralidoxine. Actually, you usually need several of these to make a significant difference. So these are intended to help dry you up. Usually very high dose. When we give atropine to most patients in bradycardia, we're usually giving a 0.5 milligram. People who need atropine to help dry them up after a chemical weapons attack like this usually are needing something like 6, 10, 20 milligrams of atropine. We may also have radiologic and nuclear weapons. Talked about this a little bit in hazmat. Radiologic, radiation, emission, or contamination. Nuclear is splitting or fusing of atoms with the release of massive amounts of energy along with radiation. So they're both radiation related. Likelihood of occurrence by a terrorist group is fairly remote because of international cooperation. There's pretty high security measures on this. So, although a chemical weapon attacks bear some similarities to hazmat incidents, you may not have information about the chemical involved. When they're going to do this, they're not going to include placards on the side of their truck. So you're going to be at a distinct disadvantage there. So use your maximum isolation distances, try to identify what's going on. So during our scene size-up, if you're dispatched to a natural disaster or terrorist event, follow the instructions of Incident Command. Again, ICS is going to be used very strongly in this situation. Safety, again, remains our highest priority, and we have to continuously be vigilant for any hazards. Inexperienced bombers who create faulty devices may be injured, so you may be dealing with a very dangerous or desperate person on the scene or in an ambulance. You're probably not going to know that. So again, if you have to be constantly aware of the situation. You have to constantly be wondering, is this a potential hazard? And in this case, this person would be, certainly. So terrorism is a crime, so it's a crime scene. Remember, try to avoid disturbing the scene, preserve the evidence as much as possible, disturb as little as possible, retain any clothing from the patients in a bag. You may even need to roll up the sheets that you had on the cot when you transport the patient. And be as thorough as possible. Even though you're documenting an MCI that usually doesn't get quite the full documentation that we do with a lot of our single patients, do your best to be complete and thorough. So, unlike paper bags, preferred for crime scene evidence, plastic bags are preferred for possible terrorism events to help give a barrier to keep from contaminating. So once you've delivered that patient to the hospital, examine the ambulance for any items or debris. Even the seemingly innocuous can be important later. So document, document, document. Caring for other responders in rehabilitation. Remember, we're going to have people that are going for hours and days on end, so we have to be concerned for them. In chemical events, make sure the patients are decontaminated before beginning any care, and use appropriate PPE. Specific treatments are going to depend on what we have. So if we have specific injuries, if we're able to identify specific toxidromes where we're starting to see patients with various signs or symptoms that are consistent, may help us identify some of those agents that were used. Suspect multi-system trauma. It's usually intended to be multiple insults. Establish ABCs. Okay, so at some point as an advanced EMT, you may have to respond to a disaster or a terrorist event. Natural disasters are common. Terrorisms are not. They tend to be targeting densely populated areas. Weapons of mass destruction can be conventional explosives, small arms, incendiary devices, chemical agents, biological agents, radiation, and nuclear weapons. Disasters in terrorism can involve many scene hazards and mechanisms. The hazard may be ongoing due to continued inclement weather or secondary devices. You need to work through the ICS system and perform your triage and transport. Perform a scene size up and remain vigilant to the hazards.